Hi class, in this recording we're going to continue talking about the exterior of the cell. As we look at the carbohydrates on the outside of the cell, they are referred to as the glycocalyx, and they're kind of a fuzzy coat in appearance. It's worth emphasizing that they are external. They are on the outside of the plasma membrane, and the carbohydrates that make these up are either going to be attached to lipids or to proteins, and they will be in the form of a glycoprotein or a glycolipid. Every human being is going to have a unique glycocalyx except for genetically identical twins. As we look at these glycocalyx, it helps to protect our bodies, it helps give us immunity to infection, defend us against cancer, determines whether or not we can receive a tissue transplant or an organ transplant. It helps our cells to stay connected within the tissues. They aid in fertilization, whether a sperm joins an egg or a secondary oocyte, and they help to aid in embryonic development and guiding the direction and formation of the tissues of a growing fetus. As we look at the microvilli on the surface of a cell, microvilli are small extensions of the cell and the cell membrane. So they're extensions of the plasma membrane. These microvilli are quite tiny, 1 to 2 microns, but because they fold back and forth so much, the microvilli give a dramatic increase, 15 to 20 times more surface area to the cell. Something that's also worth emphasizing, I'll shift colors here to blue, is that the cytosol of the cell extends up into the microvilli. And this means, hey Ben, I'm making a recording. Could you please, okay, could you go downstairs please, Ben? And as the cytosol of the cell extends upward into the microvilli, that cytosol is going to allow for chemicals to go across the plasma membrane and then be absorbed into the cell and carried down to the main body of the cytoplasm. If there's a very dense concentration of microvilli on the surface of a cell, sometimes it looks like there's a brush border. It almost looks like there's a velvety appearance to the apical surface of the cell, or the surface of the cell exposed to the hollow cavity. As we look at microvilli, some microvilli are going to have actin filaments within them, and these actin filaments are going to be tugged towards the center of the cell in order to help maximize the rate that nutrients are absorbed by those microvilli. As we look at cilia, cilia are here shown in this figure, and within human beings, cilia function to move a substance past the surface of the cell. If you've taken microbiology, you learn about how some bacterium use cilia as a form of locomotion. But as we look at these cilia, note first that there can be fairly numerous, that we have 15 to 200 per cell. These cilia will form waves and beating waves, and as these cilia beat with waves, there typically is going to be a layer of saline water, and then they can move a substance like mucus over the surface of that saline water. And the cilia beat freely. In order to maintain that saline layer, there's going to be chloride pumps constantly pumping -1 chloride ions into the extracellular fluid, and then sodium ions and water molecules follow. The mucus will then float on top of the saline layer as the cilia moves the mucus around within our bodies. A classic example of this is the mucociliary escalator in our lungs. That mucociliary escalator is going to move mucus out of our lungs so that we can cough it up and then swallow it and expunge the material from our bodies. Here's the first disease we're going to talk about this semester, cystic fibrosis. As we look at cystic fibrosis, this is a hereditary disease, and this disease is associated with improper chloride pumps. These chloride pumps either fail to install in the plasma membrane, or they are installed and completely non-functional. So because the chloride pumps are not working appropriately, we don't have enough saline on the surface of the cell. And if we don't have enough saline on the surface of the cell, the mucus tends to get thick and clog up the tissue and the openings of those tissues. So when we think of the pancreatic duct within the pancreas, the mucus can plug the pancreatic duct, and digestive enzymes from the pancreas have a hard time getting into the small intestine, and mucus tends to build up within the respiratory tract, the lungs and the trachea. What does this cause? Well, this means ultimately that there's inadequate digestion of nutrients, and we have an inadequate absorption of oxygen. Because of all the mucus building up in the lungs, that mucus is a great place for bacteria to grow. So individuals that have cystic fibrosis have chronic respiratory infections and typically are going to pass away due to this disease, typically by the age of 30. I know for me personally, I had a classmate with cystic fibrosis. She was 1 year behind me in high school, and she was talking to us about her regimen, and she had to spend a half an hour a day wearing a vibrating vest, hanging upside down. She said a half an hour every morning, hanging upside down at about a 40-degree angle, wearing a vibrating vest to physically shake the mucus out of her lungs. And then every night before she went to bed, she spent another half an hour in the vibrating vest, shaking the mucus out of her lungs, so to minimize the amount of respiratory infections that she incurred. Another extension of the cell is flagella, and within human beings, the only cell type that has a flagella is the sperm. And because human sperm only has one flagella, instead of saying flagella plural, we're going to say flagellum singular. As we look at the flagellum, it's a whip-like structure that the cell uses as a form of locomotion. And as we look at this whip-like structure, its axoneme is identical to the cilium's axoneme. The main difference, though, is that it's much longer. So the generalized structure, it's like a big cilia, for lack of a better analogy. And to help strengthen the flagella, it's going to be stiffened with very coarse fibers that will support the tail, and the movement of the flagella can be undulating, snake-like, and or described as corkscrew. A key distinction between flagella, or in this case flagellum, and cilia is that there's no power stroke and or recovery strokes associated with it. Another extension of the cell membrane is the pseudopod. And as we think of a pseudopod, pseudo means false, pod means foot. It's a false foot. And we can think of a pseudopod as an extension of the cell. And usually we associate pseudopods with white blood cells that are engulfing bacteria or foreign particles that don't belong in the body. That's all we have for this recording on extensions of the cell membrane. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them on the class discussion board or to shoot me an email. And as always, happy studies.